I think that's a challenge we all face in this work, is how to help as we're doing this work and as we're down at the level of action and planning and teaching workshops. How do we help people see the bigger picture? And I think that's really why, I see storytelling as such a crucial piece of our work, and why we need to be keeping the larger vision ever before us of what we're after.
In this episode of Voices from the Field, we meet Fred Bahnson, NCAT's new executive director. Fred tells us the story of the journey that led him to NCAT and talks with sustainable agriculture specialist Mike Lewis about the strength of NCAT's resources and staff and some of the organization's many programs. Let's listen.
Welcome to this episode of Voices from the Field. My name is Mike Lewis. I'm a sustainable agriculture specialist with the National Center for Appropriate Technology based in southeastern Kentucky. And I'm excited to talk to everybody today about some change that's coming up in NCAT. This is a very exciting time for us at the National Center for Appropriate Technology as we approach 50 years of history serving communities all across the United States. And we were actually founded in 1976 in response to the oil crisis of the 1970s with the mission of developing appropriate low-cost energy-saving strategies for underserved communities. And the one constant that has remained in our roots is our organizational capacity to adapt to the changing needs of the communities that we serve. One of those big changes came in 1987 when we were one of the first organizations to recognize the intersection of energy and agriculture, and that was a major underserved and critical aspect of support for the communities, for rural communities and urban communities working towards sustainability goals. And thus that launched our expansive body of work in sustainable agriculture with our ATTRA program, which we'll talk about a little bit later in more detail. And if you flash forward today, and that change is still in the air here with us today. In fact, that's the reason we're here to talk to you today. Earlier this year, our executive director, Steve Thompson, announced his upcoming retirement, and the folks at the executive committee and the board began their search for a new executive leadership to take our organization to this next evolution of our work. I would be remiss not to mention that Steve oversaw one of the largest periods of programmatic growth in our organizational history, and did so with grace and tremendous forethought for the future, and really did a great job laying a foundation for our future work. And while he will be greatly missed, I personally think he's earned a lot of fishing and hiking trips in the coming years, and all of us here at NCAT want to thank him and wish him all of the best in his retirement, and hope he has a great time. He will be missed, but I'm excited to have the privilege and the honor of introducing everyone here to NCAT's newest executive director, Fred Bahnson. Fred, welcome to NCAT, and I'm hoping you wouldn't mind to take a few minutes to introduce yourselves to the listeners and provide some context as to why you chose NCAT as the next stop in your storied career.
Thank you, Mike. Really great to be with you today. Yeah, my background, I come from a pretty mixed background as I look back on the trajectory my life and vocational journey have taken. I went to divinity school in the late 90s, which is not exactly what you'd think would qualify me for the job of director of NCAT. But it was at divinity school, actually, where I first got a taste of agrarian thinking and practice. I started reading Wendell Berry, who I know is familiar and dear to many listeners. And he sort of derailed me from a career in academic teaching and theology and ethics. And I got really interested in the way food is grown, where our food comes from, all those kinds of questions that a lot of eaters have started asking in the last decade or two, having experienced a kind of the industrial food disconnect that so many of us live with. And in asking those questions, I ended up helping start a low-income community garden in rural North Carolina. I first went to get some training in permaculture. I did a permaculture certificate on a farm in North Carolina. And my wife and I bought a little place and started growing our own food, raising milk goats. And so after a couple of years of doing that, I helped start a small-scale community farm and directed that project for 4 years in Orange County, North Carolina. And that was an amazing experience in just getting people excited about growing food together and doing it in community and building community through community-supported agriculture. and empowering low-income families to grow their own food and to learn how to cook fresh food again and cook with fresh ingredients. And that experience really kind of set me on the trajectory I've been on. And I ended up helping start a kind of sustainable ag leadership program at Wake Forest University Divinity School, teaching faith leaders and nonprofit leaders how to get more involved in agriculture, how to support local farms, how to help build local food economies, build local sustainable food systems, and using faith communities and nonprofits as a kind of locus or hub to do that work from. And so a lot of my work has been focused on the community and education and advocacy side of regenerative ag and food justice and increasingly climate advocacy. And so, for me, a lot of those threads come together in this work I'm doing now at NCAT as the new executive director. And I should say too, I've kind of had a parallel career as a writer and multimedia storyteller. And so I'm really excited to bring those storytelling skills to the work here at NCAT, because I think you guys have just such amazing stories, among the staff and the people that we serve. And those stories need to be more widely shared. And I'm excited to help do that and expand our storytelling efforts. So that's a little of me. And, I've been thinking through this sort of introductory podcast. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, Mike, because this is really about NCAT's work, and want to shift the focus there and ask you a question here. We were talking earlier about, I mentioned Wendell-Berry, and I know you went through the Wendell-Berry farming program. We were talking about his essay in Distrust of Movements. And one of the things he says in there, he said, most of us are living on the far side of a broken connection in terms of our connection to land. He says, most people are fed or clothed or sheltered from sources toward which they feel no responsibility. And as I was thinking about that kind of broken connection we've all inherited culturally here in the US, I see a lot of NCAT's work is helping to restore that broken connection with land, restore connections that people have to their food shed and their watershed, and help build community resilience as we restore those connections. And I'm curious, in your experience, do you see your work in some sense as an active restoration? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's, such a great point. To add a little bit of flavor to that wonderful quote you just read, Wendell's brother, John Berry, famously called this a crisis by design, right? It was, the way the markets evolved, they sort of were designed to disconnect us from things, where we live, where we eat, how we get our food. We still live in a world where most people don't realize a carrot grows in the dirt. We still have school kids out at the farm on field days that aren't making those connections. And I think that's not only is it an important part of my work, it's one of the most enjoyable, both in terms of personal fulfillment and then in terms of feeling like you've accomplished something, because a lot of these connections are right there, and we've just sort of been conditioned not to see them or look for them. So it's always, it always feels really good to make a connection, whether it's connecting a buyer to a farmer or a farmer to an educational resource. I think that, sort of the spirit of that essay was about how we've become disconnected from everything. So I think it's very important that we reconnect. As you're listening to this podcast, I'll say unplug, get to know your neighbor. Not that we don't want you listening. So yeah, and I think a lot of our work does that. Further in that essay, he talks about how you can't be for one specific movement because everything is interconnected. So if you're for clean water, that means you're for clean air. That means you're for equity and justice in land use for people living in marginalized communities. And so I think that's one of the great things about NCAT is we touch so many different aspects of what it means to be a resilient community and what it takes to move forward in a sustainable and equitable pathway. So yeah, that's my favorite part about being here, is that we have such an impact just through making connections.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier in our conversation a few days ago that one of the things you love a bit about NCAT is that it touches on the whole system, that we're not just working on soil health. We're not just working on water. We're not just working on renewable energy. We're working on all these different fronts and trying to knit that together. I'm curious, One of the things I think can be challenging for people who are either doing this work or getting into this kind of work for the first time and wanting to help restore some of those broken connections that we have with the land, with our sources of food, with our sources of energy. It could feel a little overwhelming, right? And it could feel a little like, boy, I'm working on this one piece. How does it connect to everything else? And I think that's a challenge we all face in this work, is how to help as we're doing this work and as we're down at the level of action and planning and teaching workshops. How do we help people see the bigger picture? And I think that's really why, I see storytelling as such a crucial piece of our work, and why we need to be keeping the larger vision ever before us of what we're after, and that could be hard to do. But I'm curious if you share are there any stories that have moved you or that animate your work, whether books or communal myths, however you think of that?
Yeah, well, that's such a great question to ask me. One of my, I believe, my capstone project for the Wendellberry farming program was a rather large essay, specifically related to the way that we are going to bring people into this movement is through arts and storytelling, because that's how we all connect. So, I mean, I don't know if it'd be hard for me to pick a specific story. Maybe as we as we trudge forward, something will pop into the vast expanse of my mind. But I will say, I mean, that's one of the great things about NCAT as a whole. I mean, and the services we provide. So that would sort of be the story, right? Our focus is not singular. We're very holistic. We touch so many areas that impact rural and urban communities, whether it's energy, food system, poverty, parity, and justice. And I always do tell this story when I'm talking about NCAT or ATTRA in our programming. I mean, that holistic approach is fully represented in the diversity of our staff, and more importantly, in our programmatic offerings. I mean, I feel very comfortable knowing that within the confines of our little NCAT staff bubble, there isn't a question or a challenge that I'm going to face trying to support a farmer or community development specialist that someone else on our staff doesn't have a significant amount of expertise in, or has dealt with that specific struggle before. So, I mean, I guess I don't have a story, but I think that organizationally we sort of represent that story. And I'm real excited to see how this storytelling piece fleshes out, because of course that's part of the reason I was drawn to the Wendellberry farming program, is because I think that people just don't know. It's very easy to look and say, well, this person's doing this and they shouldn't be doing that. But if they're not being told the stories, we can make all kinds of decisions, but if we're not empowered with knowledge and storytelling, we're not going to make the changes or the readjustment and direction that needs to be made for success.
Yeah, it's like, I think of our work too as like cultural renewal in a way, like we're helping people heal from the ravages of industrialization, which have separated us from our food, from the land, from each other. And that's healing work.
Learn how to harvest the sun twice with practical information at NCAT's AgriSolar Clearinghouse. Get access to more than 400 peer-reviewed articles, the latest in agri-solar news, and connect with farmers and solar developers who are working together to make the most out of our shared resources. We'll see you at agrisolarclearinghouse.org.
Speaking of this theme of healing and restoration, I'm really intrigued with our Arm to Farm program and helping vets both heal through connection to the land, but also gain real practical skills and learn how to set up a farming operation. And we're coming up on our 10-year, I think this is our 10-year anniversary of that program, Arm to Farm, or A2F as it's known. I think you went through that program, maybe even went to the first workshop. Is that right? Could you say a little about that program?
Well, of course, it's near and dear to my heart. And I actually went to the first pilot before it was Arm to Farm. It was a veterans workshop in Pennsylvania. That would have been, I'm stretching, but 2010 or 2011, somewhere in there in terms of my memory recall. And actually, that program, going through that program, is one of the things that inspired me to go back to college and focus on this work. It was the first time I met Andy Pressman, who at the time was just a sustainable agriculture specialist, but now is the director of our sustainable agriculture and rural communities program. And I felt like it was the first time that anybody was really like not trying to push me into expanding my farm operation or increasing my debt load. And nobody else was telling me that this was going to be hard, and I knew it was going to be hard from having fumbled with it for 2 or 3 years myself. So, of course, it has a special place in my heart as a program. And then one of the most important things about it that I don't think it gets spoken about enough is, the amount of money and time and energy that we as a nation have invested in our military. And the fact is, when we're training our military, we are training leaders, right? And so I think it's, one of the reasons that drew me to working with veterans in agriculture was specifically that fact that there are leadership skills that are needed here, right? Because farming isn't just about farming anymore, right? It's about marketing, it's about community development, and it's about all of these things. And when you look at the sort of for lack of a better word, the food system crisis that is impending or that we're in, whatever your perspective is on that right now, who better to work on a community level to rectify that than this national asset that we have that we sort of forget once they get out of the military. And, so, I mean, I think that that is a huge part of this program. And it's been amazingly successful. And I think it's partially successful because of Margot Hale, who leads that program for us. Part of that's due to her leadership, but a big part of that is because we're working with people and groups of people that understand a challenge, understand how teamwork is critical to solving a challenge. And I think that's a large part of the reason the program has been so successful. I mean, over 80, I don't have the exact statistic, but over 80% of the participants that have been through this program, which over 10 years has been over 1,000, are still farming. And I would challenge you to find another program where that level of success is in existence. And I think it's but outside of that, I mean, not only have we trained them in business planning and marketing and production techniques, I mean, it's been so successful now that we have a 2.0 program, which is geared towards helping farmer veterans expand on their operation and learn how to make wise decisions about how you grow into new markets and increase capacity on your farm safely and mitigating as much risk as you possibly can in the current agriculture climate, both economic and climatic,
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's an incredible program, and I think a lot of it is the network too. That would be the third thing that I think is important. These folks form bonds. I participate in anywhere from 4 to 6 armed farms a year on behalf of NCAT and ATTRA, and these folks, these 20 or 30 people that are in these working groups, they build connections. And, I hear weekly, get text messages from past participants who are working with another participant. Just last week, one of our Colorado folks called me and told me how he's now working with one of the farmers he met to acquire beef cattle and learn how to put his fencing infrastructure in and rotational grazing. And I think that just speaks to the strength of that program and what a legacy.
Yeah. As you're talking, Mike, I'm also thinking about how I'm thinking back on the 4 years where I was a grower as kind of director and farmer in chief of this little community supported farm that I directed in North Carolina. And those 4 years, I was putting in 60, 70 hour weeks, and it's one of the hardest jobs I've ever had, just being out there managing an acre and a half of intensive vegetable production. We were feeding over 100 families a week, and I was responsible for that. It was a ton of work. And I think you quickly learn in that kind of situation, you quickly get past the romantic image of what a farmer is and does, and you're just faced with the reality of what it takes to put food in the ground and care for plants and care for animals. And thinking about, I think a lot of folks who try their hand at farming or want to get back into it, there's the romantic image quickly wears off. And I think, I see vets as kind of uniquely positioned to be ahead of that learning curve because they've already faced adversity and they're used to discipline, they're used to structure, they're used to encountering obstacles that they just got to deal with and not whine about, and I think it seems like vets are in a way uniquely positioned to be great farmers. I'm curious if you've experienced that too.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you hit it right. Like the job has to be done whether you want to do it or not, right?
Yeah.
That's the first thing, and that's the first. But then I think that the other thing that really I think speaks to that is the level of situational awareness, right? As these veterans are trained to be keenly aware of their surroundings, paying attention to multiple things at a different time, and I think that plays out into it as well. And then I think the other thing that I see talked about a little bit, but not a lot, is this idea of service, right? I mean, veterans are unique in the fact that they willingly signed up potentially to give up everything to serve. And when we think of that, we think, well, they're serving the country, but most of the disproportionate number of our veterans come from rural communities. And so I think when they sign up and they think about service, they're thinking about service to their community. So there's already this sort of commitment to service and serving others and helping advance the community goals or the national goals or whatever. I've been trying to make it back about community, but I think that service component is deeply ingrained in the mindset as well. And I think that farming is just another way to cultivate on that veteran's desire to serve others and to help and support.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the awesome things about NCAT is we are working on so many different fronts, and we've been talking about the Arm to Farm program. I'm curious too to hear more about our Soil for Water program. What is Soil for Water? What are we doing there? What's the potential there?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's one of the fastest growing programs at NCAT, our Soil for Water program, and its primary focus is on building a dynamic community of people who are curious and interested in learning more about how water interacts with soil, right? And how proper practices can sort of create these resilient and more profitable agriculture systems. I will say that this is the first program that I'm aware of that's specifically focused on the interaction between soil health and water holding capacity. Sort of one of the things we hear coming out of those meetings a lot is the soil sponge, right? And so Soil for Water is really a program designed to help farmers understand how to deal with water issues or concerns on their farm. Whether it's, in the West, we have drought, right? Here in the East, we have flooding. And the impact that soil and soil health plays on how that water moves through the ecosystem is what this program is about. Soil is a better sponge. It's holding more of that water in the soil to release to plants in the ecosystem and all the bacteria and everything that lives in your soil. It's also able to hold more nutrients. And I think the really neat thing about Soil for Water is that it's accomplishing the goals of the program by working to build these peer-to-peer learning systems, and then also using adaptive management and research plots that lead to like practical real world solutions for some of the challenges that producers face. And this work building that support network of ag producers, and its work is centered on building a network of ag producers and technical service providers and ancillary partners who want to learn together. And also project provides free technical assistance to farmers and ranchers to help boost their success through wherever you are in your regenerative agriculture sort of arc, whether you're a beginning farmer who is trying to reclaim some soil that's been mismanaged or overgrazed, or whether you're a regenerative grazer trying to increase the water holding capacity of your soil. I think the great thing about it is most of these are field to field, farmer to farmer, right? So there, we have farmer field days, pasture walks where farmers are sharing, and I think that's important. And I think that's not to go off on a little tangent, but I think it merits mentioning. A while back, I started thinking about the technical assistance that I provide farmers on a daily basis, and I realized that about 80 or 90% of the knowledge that I was sharing with farmers on how to face challenges wasn't from me. It was from when, Farmer Joe called me to come out and help him with an irrigation system, and I saw something else going on. And I said, what is this? Oh, this is how you dealt with this problem. And so most of the knowledge and the support that we provide comes from other farmers. And I think the great thing, and we know through all of our research into adult education that peer-to-peer is the best way for grown-ups like us to learn. And so that's the great thing about this program, is it really focuses on farmers educating farmers about the challenges they're facing versus like researchers or someone like me who just saw it on your farm and was like, hey, you should talk to Fred because Fred just had this problem. Let me connect you. And so I think that's the powerful thing about that program, is that it is intensively peer-to-peer based. And then also that's another great thing about NCAT, right? That's why we're known as a trusted practical connector, because we're out in the field and we know if we don't know the answer, we know who to connect to in terms of a producer or a researcher that's dealing with that exact same issue that you may have. So I'm a big fan of peer-to-peer networks, obviously.
Yeah, that's one of our hallmarks, definitely. Yeah, and I'm intrigued too with our Soil for Water program and this whole question of scale, especially thinking about how to conserve water out west. I come from basically I grew up in Montana, but I moved to North Carolina in the late 90s, and all of my agricultural training and experience happened in the East Coast, on a very micro scale, a couple of acres. My wife and I started a 1 acre permaculture hillside farm that we managed for 10 years. We took it from sort of abandoned cow pasture phase all the way up to a fully functional food forest, which you can do in 10 years in the East Coast with 80 inches of rain a year, which we had in Transylvania County, North Carolina. But, conserving water through soil structure and through sort of sculpting the land, that's a key permaculture principle. And, one of the mantras is slow it, spread it, and sink it. You want to slow that water in your site, you want to spread it out, you want to sink it down and hold it. You don't want it to run off. And we did that on our hillside through swales, building little ditches on contour to hold that water and sink it. And I see a lot of that happening now on a macro scale too, and it's really fascinating to me to think that a lot of these sort of small scale, smallholder farmer ideas, very low tech water conservation practices are now being applied out west on thousands of acres. And that's pretty exciting to think that, that we can modify and help transform and heal vast swaths of land. It doesn't just have to be a little backyard garden or farm, but we can do that, on the scales that we have out west. That's pretty exciting.
Absolutely. And this makes me think one of the things I learned from one of the Soil for Water webinars that I guess I should have known, but I didn't have it framed properly. But the capacity for the soil to hold water far exceeds the capacity of all the watersheds on the planet. And I found that fascinating. It really makes you think, well, what can I do to be a little better? Whether that's, as you say, building swales or properly moving livestock through a system and making sure you're planting the right crops. You have to include some native species in your pasture, So and I think the interesting thing about that program too is that it's so different, right, from being out west, as you said, 80 inches of rain in the east. You can grow a forest in 10 years. I have 8-year-old black walnut trees that are producing nuts this year, because of the weather and the climate. So,
and I think this is part of the mentality that we bring to our work too, is a kind of that emphasis on low tech, on building soil structure and water holding capacity in the soil, instead of going the kind of GMO high tech, high dollar approach, where you see companies saying, well, to develop drought resistant crops, we have to create drought resistant varieties and we have to use GMO techniques to do that, which costs millions of dollars. It's a genie that we don't want to let out of the bottle. We've seen what happens with that. And you can solve for that by just building soil organic matter, right? You can hold much more water in soil that has a higher carbon amount. And so it's a mentality shift that I think we have to help people see as well, is that it doesn't take a ton of money and gene jockeys in a lab, as Wes Jackson refers to GMO crops. It doesn't take gene jockeys. It takes farmers out educating each other about these low cost, low tech practices that are much better for the land and much better for animals as well.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up because when you in terms of the technology aspect of that, because we get this a lot in the field, right? Appropriate technology. You have drones and sprayers and all of
Right.
this, and we're like, no, this is sort of born out of the 60s and 70s. It's small scale, it's low cost, it's region specific, it's easy to use. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it does get back to that. That's the original appropriate technology, right? I mean, soil.
Yeah.
It's that old story about when man got so smart that they said to God, they said, "Oh, we can do anything you can do now," and then God takes away the soil and says, "All right, now do it." I mean, where are you now? And I think soil is so important, and of course, you have a book about that, right? So I'm not telling you anything, but yeah, I think it's such an important thing, and I don't want to say it's easy. It's an easy technology to manage because it's complex and it's interactive, and there's so many things. But it's one of the most basic pieces of technology that, as a producer, you can interact with and pretty quickly change the direction of your production systems in a positive way. So,
yeah. So I'm curious, Mike, about our agri-solar work. That program was recently featured on CBS Saturday Morning, and our energy director, Stacy, was featured there and was talking about the great potential to get more solar on farms and to have that be a sort of another crop is, harvesting the sun, not only harvesting lambs or, row crops, but combining those things. I'd love to hear you just tell us a little bit about our agri-solar work.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say it's all fairly new to me, but I'm definitely, since the news story with Stacy came out, I've been getting a lot more calls on it here in the Appalachian region, and so I have some baseline info, but I'm by no means an expert on the agri-solar subject matter, but we certainly have a lot of staff that do a lot of work with that. But primarily right now what we have is we do have the AgriSolar Clearinghouse. That was made possible through a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Energy. And that is a nationwide hub that was developed by NCAT and partners and advisory board to sort of connect. This hub is designed to connect businesses, landowners, and researchers with the resources to help accelerate the growth of co-located solar installations with sustainable agriculture systems. So that's sort of known as agrivoltaic development. The reason I think that this is critically important work is in terms of introducing this agri-solar concept onto farms is, farms mostly are in rural communities, right? And rural communities face some of the biggest challenges with energy grids. And so, it goes a long way towards that sort of appropriate, resilient community mindset. But secondarily, the government figures say that it's expected to be over 3 million acres of land in the United States by, I think, 2030 that are going to be covered with solar installations. And typically, they sit on these installations sit on top of like stripped land, right? Or single use land, which, just talking about these interactions, how, what we just talked about with soil for water plays into this idea. Well, if we have stripped land, that's creating runoff. Runoff is creating a whole host of other problems. And so expanding these agrivoltaics on more what we would call solar appropriate lands, right, and integrating them into farms will allow the farmers and the solar producers to maximize that land. Then we start thinking about ecosystem services, right? We're diversifying ecosystem services within that plot of land and within the areas that touch that land. We're increasing pollinator and wildlife habitats. And then secondarily, if you're a farmer, you're increasing the revenue on that acre, potentially without giving up production. As you said, if we're grazing sheep under that system, that land is still in use. So as a producer, I'm deriving revenue from my regular crop of sheep, but I'm also, generating revenue, whether it's a leased agreement for the solar panels to be there, or whether it's something I've grid tied. And so I think, there's so much potential and so much interest in it. When we had our all staff meeting in Denver, we toured a massive solar array system that was providing energy to local homes and producing organic vegetables underneath the panels in a system together.
Beautiful.
And so, that's where like NCAT's team of energy engineers and then our sustainable agriculture specialists and the network of partners really come in handy at helping farmers understand how this could, number one, be implemented on their farm, but then also understand the drawbacks, the upsides, and then how to actually physically make it happen. So a lot of potential. And I think, potentially over the next 10 years, some of the most important work that we could be doing, because again, it's, energy and agriculture, which is, those two things are all, well, not so much anymore, right? Because we're tracking and doing life cycle assessments on crop rotations and energy use on farms. But I think it's just such a critical component to the future of sustainability and to help mitigating, some of these climate issues that are coming up from fossil fuels. And I can tell you, I live in a community of 300 people, and how amazing would it be to have our own energy grid tied to, the 8 or 10 farms in my community. So then your energy and your food comes from your farm. I think that's probably what it was like in, the French intensive systems in Paris in the 1800s, right? Your energy
right.
for your systems came for the whole city came from the farms.
Yeah. And where they were growing lettuce in the wintertime in greenhouses in the 1800s, winter production in Paris at high latitudes.
Amazing, and I actually read a book about the boys that ran the wheelbarrows of horse manure from the city center out to the secondary farms that sort of had the lettuce, and they'd use those to heat the intensive beds. And there's so many things that we could be doing if we felt empowered and had the right sort of direction and guidance. And I think the agri-solar program at NCAT is huge potential to impact the way that farmers farm, the way that we use and consume energy. It's just exciting stuff.
Yeah, it is. I love what you said earlier, that soil is the original appropriate technology. And I think combining that with, modern solar and agrivoltaic panels, soil and solar together, it's a pretty beautiful combination.
Those are the two original, right? Day and night and soil. There you go. That's what we were blessed with, and that's what we have to make the most of. And I think that's what AgriSolar is doing, is utilizing both of our greatest assets in the most efficient way possible. So Fred, it's been an absolute honor to have this time to talk with you and to talk about some of the amazing work that's happening across all of our projects at NCAT, and just really, really excited about the future and about having you on board. And if you have any last words, I'd love to hear them. But other than that, I appreciate your time and energy today.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, no, this has been really great to chat with you, and looking forward to seeing you in New Hampshire with some of the other team members for one of the Arm to Farm workshops, the 2.0, later in August. I hope to get down to Kentucky and see you in Berea as well, and revisit the Appalachian region, which is near and dear to my heart. To all the listeners out there, I'm just really thrilled to be joining this amazing team here at NCAT, and I'm super excited about the years ahead. I think we have a lot of great work ahead of us, and I'm really honored to be part of that.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.incat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.